My name is Irina Dumitrescu. I'm this year's Public Humanities Faculty Fellow at the Jackman Humanities Institute. And today's event is Craft Matters, a conversation with Ruby Lal, about whom I will introduce in a moment. And I am usually at the University of Bonn as a medievalist. This year, I have the pleasure of spending my time at the JHI with the fellowship here and with our guests, talking about pleasure, about the public humanities, and it's a particularly rich opportunity to be in Toronto for this work. And so it's my honor also, while I'm in Toronto, to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and I'm grateful to have the opportunity to live and to work on this land. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our guest, Professor Ruby Lal, who is an acclaimed historian of India and professor of South Asian Studies at Emory University. Most recently, the author of Empress, The Astonishing Reign of Noor Jahan, which was a finalist in history for the Los Angeles Times Book Prize and won the Georgia Author of the Year Award in Biography. And it's also the reason I know her work and I got to know Ruby. It's a book I admire a great deal. Her scholarly monographs include Domesticity and Power in the Early Mughal World and Coming of Age in 19th Century India, The Girl Child and the Art of Playfulness. She's currently at work on a new biography, Rebel Princess, The Great Adventures of Gulbadan, for Yale University Press. And I say that, but I know in fact she's at work on a number of things. So that's short selling the incredible energy and scholarly brilliance of our guest today. Ruby, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Irina. I'm really delighted. This is an event I've been looking forward to, although we are all experiencing Zoom fatigue. I especially want to express my gratitude to Alison and to Sonia for organizing, for supporting, and for the invitation, and to the Jackman Humanities Institute. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. Ruby, I wonder if we could start us off by hearing a little bit of your writerly voice, and perhaps you could read a bit to us from Empress.
Okay. Just raising my own book and reading. It's a small extract from the beginning, and the chapter is called Queen of Queens. On October 23rd, 1619, Noor Jahan mounted an elephant and settled into the howdah, the elaborate litter on the animal's back, holding a musket. The mahout, the elephant handler, led her along the sandy track toward the forest. Noor Jahan accompanied her husband, Emperor Jahangir, on his own elephant, and they were followed by a long line of courtiers, some on superbly ornamented elephants and horses, and others in red and gold jeweled palanquins, with silken seats decorated with garlands of flowers and carried by attendants. Portraits of Noor Jahan from the period suggest that she was wearing a regal turban, much like the ones favored by the emperor and distinguished noblemen, but highly unusual for a woman. A knee-length tunic with a sash around the waist over tight trousers, and earrings and necklace of rubies, diamonds, or pearls. Her shoes were open at the back, exposing the henna designs on her feet. At 42, she was still praised by her contemporaries for her luminous beauty. Local hunters on foot guided the party past fields of barley, peas, and cotton, lush from the recent rains. Along the way, they spotted herds of cattle, goats, and blackbuck with long corkscrew horns. When they reached the forest, the emperor and empress could barely see beyond the dense wall of creepers, bushes, and trees, lofty neem, thorny babool, and many others. The hunters showed the empress and her retinue the spot where the tiger was likely to appear, and they waited. Soon, Noor's elephant in the lead began groaning and stepping nervously from side to side. The mahout couldn't make it stand still, and Noor Jahan's howdah lurched precariously. From his own elephant, Jahangir looked on, silent and focused. Later, he would recall the moment in the Jahangir Nama, the memoirs of Jahangir, a journal he began when he ascended to the throne in 1605 that would serve as the public record of his reign. An elephant is not at ease when it smells a tiger and is continually in movement, he wrote. And to hit with a gun from a litter is a very difficult matter. The tiger emerged from the trees. Noor lifted her musket, aimed between the animal's eyes, and pulled the trigger. Despite the swaying of her elephant, one shot was enough. The tiger fell to the ground, killed instantly. Jahangir was delighted. A woman shooting publicly was rare. A woman shooting with such expertise was unheard of.
Thank you, Ruby. This is, I mean, I love this passage. I love the whole introduction, but I think this passage shows so much about how you weave the historical background and in a really writerly way to make it dramatic. And while I ask my first question, I'll just remind everyone that they can put questions in the Q&A, but we'll get started with our conversation and I'll, not in the Q&A, in the chat, and I'll be checking the chat as we go along. But I wonder if I could ask you just to talk a little bit about how you came to write this book in particular, which was also a turn for you from a traditional scholarly work to a much broader audience, a more public voice, a different approach to the writing. How did that transition take place?
That's a lovely question. And, in a way, I have to encapsulate sort of 5 or 6 years of this life that I've had, writing about this woman and still thinking about it. The process was very generative and extremely painful. I want to be candid. And it is actually a matter of tone. And when I say tone and the change of tone, people use different kinds of things and everybody's experimentation and practice is specific. People call it finding their voice, narrative style, all sorts of things. I think for me, the challenge was really keeping my integrity as a scholar, completely working through the nitty-gritty of archival obsessions that I've had, and I want to talk about those, but also really how to weave those complications into very intense storytelling. And into very intense storytelling for me is actually a personal journey. I met Noor Jahan for the first time when I was a little girl. And the storyteller was my mother. And I was very restless. I loved her stories. I had 2 younger sisters, and my mother was a full-time housekeeper. And in the afternoons, she would find time to play this game. We call it Game Gitta in Hindi, but it's like the American game of jacks. And I remember this one afternoon, she was playing with me, and I got very bored, and I said, I wanted a story. And she told me for the first time, she'd been telling me stories. For the first time, she told me the story of Noor Jahan. And in Hindi, the language, our language, her language and mine, she called her Maharani, Queen of Queens. And, the details of the day are hazy in my mind, but I remember the glint in her eye and my obsession and what it did to me. I was completely besotted by this, sword-wielding poet, Empress. And of course, she'd been written out of history. We did not know her. And over time, I became, a Mughal historian, fell in love with this history, wrote about, the whole work was really, when my first book started, by thinking about the haram, which had itself been a complicated domain in the wider public imagination, but also in the scholarly public imagination, in that, it was said we didn't need to do this because we knew all there was to this domain. So all of these things linked. And I came to writing about Noor Jahan at the invitation of, I just finished my second scholarly book, and I got this email from this editor in India, actually, saying that we don't have the definitive biography of Noor Jahan. Won't you write this? And so, of course, I started kicking myself in the back, saying, this was supposed to be my woman. I had to think about this. But the idea grew on me. And the more I thought about this, the more I realized that, storytelling was going to be the way. I wanted to put her on the world map along with, a vast number of, glorious, incredibly powerful. And I use the word powerful with great care. I don't mean this simple assertion of, going and conquering the world. I mean, these are very complicated senses of power. But really all of this to say that the transition wasn't easy. I was very devoted to my scholarly ways of thinking. So just to make the story really short, I wrote a full draft in 2014. And when I showed it to my editor, she said, this is a wonderful Cambridge University Press book, but this is not a Norton book. But I believe if I hadn't done that work, and if I hadn't done the work that I've done all the way through, I wouldn't have struggled with, what tone it needed, how. So the scene I read you, just to give you a concrete example of the changes that were taking place. Every line in the scene can be backed by documentation. And in particular, I want to, if I may, just share the screen with you and show you one incredible portrait that was well known, and I'll tell you how that kind of works into this transition. I'm assuming you're able to see this portrait of Noor Jahan with a musket, painted by court painter Abul Hassan Nadir-uz-Zaman. And the dates, before I go on about the process, just a little by way of background. This is held in the Rampur Raza Library in North India. Extremely well-known painting, heavily worked at by art historians, tremendous art historians who I leaned on to. So I'm trained as an historian, but really while writing this book, the world is so visual that I had to really train myself in the iconographies of this kind of art. This is, of course, literally, this is the size 6 inches by some 4.5 or something. So this is the Mughal miniature painting. And the painter who drew it was the court painter of the emperor who she marries, her second husband. She was his 20th wife. And this is painter Abul Hassan, Nadir-uz-Zaman, wonder of the ages. And he was an expert at making portraits. But in this painting that he makes, he actually breaks away from his own oeuvre in various ways. First is that typically in the Mughal atelier, you had paintings of women that were highly stylized. That is, all women looked the same. They were all bejeweled, and they were decked, and the faces were similar. You could tell one from the other, maybe by the fall of the skirt or the way the shawl was wrapped, or a certain action or where she was placed. This is highly distinctive, and one in which, of course, she's dressed as I read out, and it's on the basis of this painting that I established what she might have been wearing when she gets on that howdah and goes for this phenomenal, shooting the killer tiger. This is the jame. Why do we know this is Noor Jahan? Because art historians establish her as such. The narrowness of the waist suggests that she's a woman. Wearing this patka was very typical. There's henna at the bottom of the feet, but most critically, and this is really unusual, we have the signature of the painter here, Abul Hassan. It says drawn by Abul Hassan. And so I became obsessed with this painting. And I thought there's a whole chapter in the book called Wonder of the Ages. I mean, Abul Hassan was called the Wonder of the Age by the emperor. And I called the title Wonder of the Ages to begin to think, what was he pondering? What was what was her majesty that he wanted to put on the canvas. So I bring this painting simply to suggest how art, for me, in writing this book, was not an insertion, right? It was not a backdrop. That art came to the forefront, right? It helped me describe who she was, her action, the majesty of scene setting, the jewels, the clothing, the hunt itself. I mean, something that I'd love to speak about more, but that's a very long answer to your first question.
But there's so much, Ruby, there's so much there, but what I kept hearing was obsession, that there's this sense, on the one hand, this childhood story, formative story from your childhood, and then a kind of obsessive turn to certain sources and images. Do you think, I mean, was that actually part of your writing process? I mean, not just in terms of the evidence for what you wrote, but was there a sort of relationship between either this personal element of what Noor Jahan meant to you, or these gorgeous visual documents? Did they help you enter a mode where you could communicate in a style that was more of a storytelling style, more of a popularly accessible style?
Yes, I mean, my whole relationship to how we historians think about the archive was transformed in writing this book. So just to give you a little bit of a background, and I began mentioning it in my early comments to the last question, when I began writing my first book, at the center of which is another formidable woman whose biography I'm now writing post Noor Jahan, called Gulbadan Begum. She writes the most extraordinary history. She's the only woman chronicler of the empire, not only of this empire, but the entire Islamic world of the time, of the late 16th and early 17th century into much later, essentially because royal women wrote poetry. And here we had not only a chronicling a history of the empire, but a rather subversive history of the empire, to which again we can come back later. But so I had this book at the center of my thinking about the harem, and I was getting asked, I was constantly being told, and it's a classic question. I mean, I'm sure you've encountered this. I'm sure Alison Keith has encountered this. Any number of our guests may have encountered this. I was asked the question, how are you going to do this? There are no sources for it. And we had this incredible chronicle sitting there. What I do with this is a different story, but I'm saying this because that kind of encounter, that kind of engagement has been, I've essentially written books around subjects where we were, posed the challenge that we can't do this, that, or the other history. The extraordinary thing about Noor Jahan, so twofold, was this is a co-sovereign for who we had copious amount of materials, okay? I mean, she's the first woman to be portrayed in the way in which she's portrayed, as I've shown you. There is, she builds the mausoleum of her parents across the river Yamuna. It's called the Baby Taj, essentially because it becomes the model for the Taj Mahal that her stepson builds, a decade and a half later on. So in the sense that she's a great, she's an experimentalist in aesthetics. She writes poetry. Signs of authority were that she actually issues her own imperial orders, and we have her stamp. And there's great innovativeness in her, in the style that she attributes to those imperial orders, which we can share later on. So the architecture part is really quite fabulous. She's a beautiful poet. There's extant poetry. It's broken, but there's some that survive. So we had all of these things, and yet, and by this time, I'm going to be modest. I've charted a field. I've opened up something called Gender Studies in Mughal History. Books have been well received. And I meet this Mughal historian, a he, who says to me, looking up, I'm discussing this painting, and he says to me, but isn't this representation? And I turned around and said to him, well, what is not representation, right? I mean, that you have you know, that Jahangir writes his own memoir. Isn't that a self-representation, if not, you know, and so on. So all these things are going on about sources around Noor Jahan. But what happens is that the close encounter that I'm doing with these sources, and you know, I began mentioning this, was that the context, for instance, right? The scene setting, where she draws her first, where she stamps her first edict, for instance, or what's happening when her parents die, right? What I mean, this is the most itinerant couple. What's happening on the road? Something that Jahangir, in his memoir, her husband, charts extensively. All these things I started. So I began looking in those very sources that are well known to people, where we habitually don't look. And they started to bring this kind of lushness to my thinking. So much so that I felt that the words were getting visual, if you know what I mean, right? That the contexts were not backdrops, that they were actually active narratives, right? So they were not fillers, right? To give you one very precise example again, Jahangir, people used to say to me, yes, his memoir, and, you know, but he doesn't say very much about Noor Jahan. And I, you know, began looking at the rereading the whole document in Persian. He has over 32 entries on Noor Jahan, and they're almost always about her hunting. And so I began to think about hunting. And I, of course, leaned on people who've done these gorgeous army histories, battling histories, and so on and so forth. It was an informal right of the sovereign to hunt, particularly killers and lions and tigers in those days. You know, any Tom, Dick, and Harry couldn't just come out and start hunting. So it acquired a very different meaning in my mind. Of course, Jahangir writing at that time was writing in a stream of consciousness, right, style. This is a particular form of chronicling. So those were the things. There was a very different engagement that happened. I think it was a relearning, but also finally, really, I do want to say this very candidly. I think this was very important to me. It became even more important to me, and I think this is what has led to actually writing this book now for young adults, which is that when I got on the road speaking about this book, which, you know, which began literally in 2018 and continues, I learned so much from my engagements from people who were, you know, sitting in the audience and asking me these questions with such passion. And it really, I mean, storytelling, so the form, to go back to storytelling, I mean, Benjamin says this, but also in the Indic tradition, you know, when you take the great epics, Mahabharata or Ramayana, when they're performed in the autumn days, in the fall, by way of theater, they're always improvised, right? It's happening, and the audience will pitch in, and then music will take place, or somebody will stand and do a counter performance, and the story transforms, right? And I think that's what I feel has happened in my exchanges with people. You know, I feel like I've just gone to another world thanks to Noor Jahan, and I've come back with this bundle of stories. And I'm, you know, thanks to everyone, I'm improvising. So the power of storytelling is really pretty immense in my mind. So sorry, once more, a very long answer.
No, you don't have to. You don't have to apologize. This is so rich, and again, I want to invite everyone to sort of think of what questions they have to ask. But I guess what I want to pull out of that is, you know, when I speak to people about public writing, especially when scholars are starting to take their first steps into public writing, so often there's an anxiety about about rigor, about their scholarly reputation, about whether they will be able to do it in a responsible way, and in a way that's sort of in line with their thinking and with their training and so on. And I think that always assumes that it's a simplification, that if you write for the general public, what you're doing is a kind of watered down version
exactly
of scholarship. And, you know, from what you say, and I can, you know, warmly recommend your book to everyone here, but it struck me very much, especially the second time around, that you actually had to know so much more to write that book than maybe a typical monograph where you're sort of pursuing a certain thesis, and everything that doesn't fit the thesis can just sort of fall by the wayside. It doesn't have to be mentioned. Whereas, you sort of have an argument, right? And that's
Yes.
and that's the point. But you built an entire world, right? Or you recovered, imaginatively recovered an entire world with its smells and its sights and its geographies and its rituals and the economies of different regions of the Mughal world and the places around it. And so it strikes me that there's in a way less space for cheating around that, right? Less space for taking a breather, because you have to fill out all of the senses in a way, and all of the context for your reader.
Exactly. I mean, and it's very spot on. I mean, it's very visceral. So my history, I mean, what is feminist history? The grounds of feminist history is that it's centrally premised upon, it's supposed to be experiential, which is why that I think that first wave phrase, personal is political, is so important. And so then what is personal? It's not just that it becomes about you, but it's how you experience that, the personal in the form of an exchange with a mother, in the form of an exchange with, younger women while you're on the road, younger men in your classes, but also, it was like the archive became all at once, the same very text became, breathing and feeling texts for me, right? I started paying attention to the shape of the trees and, the lands, the rivers. They became, as I was saying, that they were not just backdrops, they became very active. And so, another sort of example and a moment where I think it really came together for me was, and it was coming together in different ways, but, just to remind our readers that, our listeners that, Noor Jahan was the 20th wife of Emperor Jahangir. And when she comes to his harem, after the death of her husband, the first husband, who was a Mughal officer, and there's a lovely, luscious, legend around and history around how he gets killed and how the emperor is implicated, etc. The history is that when any officer was implicated in any form of scandal, his family would be brought to the harem, which is the emperor's domestic world. By this time, of course, Noor Jahan's father is the prime minister of the empire. So she's 32. She has a daughter called Beloved, Ladli. They come. And of course, they marry, and then, point of writing, it's called The Astonishing Reign of Noor Jahan, is not to stop at her marriage at 1611, which is where typically all films, fiction, drama, one opera, it's a love story, right? And so I wanted the love story, but I also wanted to, really to bring to the center stage of world history the most succulent part of this history, which is her sovereignty, right? So the question was, how did what she did become possible? He had 19 other superb wives. What happened here? And the more I thought about it, the more I figured that, what has also been written out of history is the 12 years of her first marriage. And that was in Bengal. She goes to an entirely different land, to the eastern provinces, which was like the Wild West of the Americas at that time. The first province, very early province to come under Mughal rule. It is the land of the Bengal tiger, right? The mansions where they'll have lived actually is adjacent to the forested areas, to the rivers, from where the beasts would typically sort of come in. History is right about all these things. I had 3 lines about this time of her life, that she marries Ali Kuli in 1594. They have a daughter. He was implicated in a scandal, which essentially meant it was a plot to kill the emperor, and he dies, right? That's all I had. So I started looking at And I have to actually thank my partner for this. He said to me, I really think, you need to really think the Eastern provinces. I think it's going to bring a great richness to the book. And so I began looking at social histories of the time of Bengal, but also the town they were in, Burdwan. What did it look like? What was happening here? It's also the land of direct communication with God, right? The gorgeous gods and goddesses of the time. And of course, Noor weaves this into her later poetry in quite beautiful ways. This very plural and eclectic sort of form of thinking, love, and divinity. So it was possible. It was possible to look at the gazetteers. It was possible to look at social histories of the time. It was possible to look at the landscape. And to my mind, it became, I kept on thinking, she leaves Agra at age 17 on this long boat, 17-year-old. And I used to think, it's like a beautiful olive leaf. And she returns to the city, back to the city in the haram as this gorgeous olive tree, right? That's the image I had in my mind. So that's the intimacy that came with those very sources that I had looked at from distance. Analysis. And analysis is fine, but it's like I'm telling you, and I was tired of telling you. I wanted to build pictures.
Did you, very quickly, did you travel anywhere specifically for the book?
I traveled to several places, of course, Agra, at the fort. Let's just share with our listeners just the fort to which she comes, what the fort looked like. I'm sorry, I think in my rearrangement of the PowerPoint, I've taken off the formidable Agra fort to which she comes. Yes, so I've worked on these areas several times. I wasn't able to go to Bengal. I ran very short of time, but I studied very closely, the older pictures, and the colonial pictures were very, very helpful. The earliest you could see in Burdwan were sort of late 18th, early 19th centuries. That was essentially pictorial and textual relationship, but a lot on Agra, a lot on Sikri. And like I said, this is a very, very itinerant couple. The dynasty is a migratory dynasty. They come from Central Asia through Afghanistan and then on to northern India. And of course, Gulbadan, the princess, is an itinerant princess. And it's only under Akbar the Great, the third Mughal emperor, the father-in-law of Noor, the emperor's father, that the first stone-walled harem made of sandstone, gorgeous red sandstone, is established. Noor's husband Jahangir actually really contests his father's authority. He's a very interesting figure, Akbar the Great. He's plural, he's eclectic, he plays with a lot of things, but he's also an egomaniac, as all these monarchs were, right? Which is why we only know the egomaniacs, and the one woman who was this succulent woman had been written out of history. Anyway, so Jahangir contests his authority, and they really, literally, this becomes a couple-intended style. He goes back to the style of his forefathers. And I really believe that co-sovereignty takes place essentially because she gets on the road. Right?
Interesting.
And that is what allowed me to turn back to Gulbadan, because she was the first to contest her nephew's authority. That is, Akbar the Great was her nephew. And he, essentially orders this amazing matriarch by this time and all the matriarchs to go behind the walls, and they're not going to have it. She contests it in a very different way.
This is wonderful. We have a question from Christy, who asks, if you found the process of research and writing different in this work from a more academic oriented book. And since you've actually talked about the research a great deal, I wonder if you could address the writing aspect of this equation. Was the actual sitting down, I mean, I know for me it feels very different if I'm writing something for the public versus more scholarly work. But how was it for you? Was the actual composition of the prose different in any way? Did you have to approach it in any different ways, or use any particular tricks or strategies to get into that mode?
Yeah, so if I may just quickly respond to the research part that Christy is asking. I think just to sum this up again, of course, I was looking habitually where we don't habitually look, right? I was looking where we habitually don't look. That's the phrase I wanted to use. But also, yes, paying a lot more attention to the kind of also the political detail, right? Weaving that in extremely deeply, thinking about terms really very, very harshly to myself. And then the new part of the research, as I've also already mentioned, is really studying the iconography of art in quite strong ways with art historians. I leaned on my colleagues. And they were really amazing. So all this had to be translated into writing, to your question, right? And I mentioned I did have that Cambridge University Press version of 2014, which was written very fast within 2.5 years. And then really, and I don't think I could have done this book without that draft, right? I still think I had to do that in order to really completely change, my style of writing. It's typical. So what did I actually I pulled out this one extract from an important chapter. It's called Ascent, that really sort of marks in precise ways her rise. And then I put it out. I thought, it may seem like a writing class and I don't want to do this. But it's a chapter I began in the 2014 version, with something like Noor and Jahangir were in Western India, they were in Gujarat. This was an important moment because the prince designate, Shah Jahan, had gone to the Deccan, and news was just about to come in of his first victory, right? Something like that. And in the revisions, I just want to read you what happened in the revision to that, first very paragraph, and it'll give you a sense of what happened. And I'll just read you 2 paragraphs. The Lashkar, the royal encampment, stretched for nearly 3 miles in open country outside the town of Ajmer in northwestern India. Embroidered awnings, some worked in gold thread, shaded the entrances to magnificent trellis tents, hundreds and hundreds of them, round, arched, and rectangular, erected on supple wooden frames covered with waxed cloth, then hung with brocade or velvets. Screens of carved wood and felt pierced in floral patterns separated one section of the camp from the other, and high red screens clearly marked the harem tents. And then I come to Noor behind this and how there are parallel meetings that are going to take place. And it's her first formal honoring of the prince. Her mother was alive and she was not mentioned. So it's an entirely different approach. I mean, I think what I had in my mind, so I'm a fan of 1950s, 40s and 50s black and white films, strong women, okay, especially spy films. And when I really need to be uplifted, that's what I go and see. And the wonderful thing is that the camera begins on this big scale and then zooms in. Mm-hmm. And I thought to myself, that's what I want to do. And I think that was one technique, literally, I had in, I won't say all chapters, but many chapters. And sometimes I just began with storytelling, like in Noor's childhood, that was also completely crafted on the basis of conduct books that were around at that time, and stories definitely she'll have wanted. So it begins with this story of this mythical tree called the Wakwak tree, on which hangs, lions and tigers and what have you. So the storytelling there came in. Sometimes it began with spatial settings, such as the scene of a first marriage, which would be in the mansion of her father. And what did it look like? Where was she sitting across the... So those were, I guess, really the techniques of storytelling is what I was drawing on. And I'm, still continuing to draw on those storytelling scenes, but spaces are very critical in the head, I think.
That's so funny because I recently took a workshop with Maria Davana Headley, who is a fantasy writer and recently translated Beowulf as well. And the workshop was on style, but she had us do a lot of place, imagining the place. And actually her approach was that if you can describe the place in which the story takes place, you already in a sense have the story. The story can come from a place, which for me was totally new. I thought it has to do with the people or it has to do with the ideas, but her approach was to say the more specifically you imagine the setting in which something takes place, the more of the story can come out of that. And she was dealing with fiction, but you're actually talking about writing history, nonfiction.
Yeah. And that's another very interesting question, right? To call it biography or to call it history. And, it's a very, I wanted to contest the idea of given biographical enterprises as well, because, most biographies are around, this biography too is around a figure, but, people used to tell me, but why didn't she leave a diary behind, and yeah, as though it becomes legitimate when you have a diary or a, or a memoir. The thing is, you have to think about time, you have to think what she leaves. And that's what I meant by iconography of the painting, of the architecture, because that's what she's leaving behind. That's what I need to understand, right? Not go searching for what I want, but what your woman is, it's a clue. She's giving you a clue, right? Essentially.
I have another very specific craft question, which is, this will sound a little bit funny maybe, but one thing that struck me about Empress is that there's a great deal of suspense in the book. And I think that's actually something that's quite hard for people who aren't trained in writing fiction to achieve, especially to achieve in a way that doesn't feel tacked on or, a kind of artificial ending to a chapter which points forward, but is a little bit clunky. But you did it very smoothly, and I wonder was that something you were thinking about consciously? Were you trying to imbue the story with a sense of suspense? Did that happen naturally as you were telling the story for life because it's so exciting, or how did that come about?
It's very nice to hear that. Actually, I didn't have suspense in mind. I really had, and I think it may well be and you've just made me realize that it may be the power of storytelling. I'm really driven by that idea because I find this, experimentation in my classes that, you teach even academic history as story. The effects are very, very different, right? The effects in getting the attention of your students, the effects in their writing, right, which I'm very engaged with. So I think it has a very different effect. So it may be that I definitely, I think, but now that you've alerted me, it's something I have to think.
Well, no, maybe you don't. Maybe you should just not think about it at all. It's working fine. But I wonder if I know, you're now at work on a version of Empress for young adult audiences. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about how that experience, because that again is a totally different kind of project than Empress. What are you learning as you go along? What are you experiencing as you go along in this new translation or transcreation of her life?
It's a lovely question, one that I'm living right now. And I think it's just It's just amazing to read these fabulous, young adult writers around, people like Jason Reynolds and several others. And I'm really learning a lot. I mean, one thing is, to call that people it's on par with what you wrote in your chronicle, your fabulous Chronicle of Higher Education piece, where you wrote that academics assume that you take off the footnotes and you have, a creative book. So it's a bit like that when you tell people that, I'm now translating this for, not translation, I mean, broadly speaking, that I'm writing this for young adults. People think that, oh, it's going to be a kid book, how fun. Well, it's very fun, but it's for young adults because, you don't want to, you meaning one, doesn't want to lessen the process, of your own work, but also of the people, right? These are brilliant readers, and, you have to learn the genre to be able to do this. And I do want to say that it's something I came to. I didn't think about this, right? I never thought I was going to write for young adults. And again, for a couple of years, each time I spoke about Empress, somebody or the other in the audience would say to me, my kids would love to read this book. Why aren't you writing this for young adults? And I thought to myself, how can I do this? And then I was in Sweden on a fellowship last year. And the same question came up in one of the conversations I had there. And at that time, I was, my very close painter friend, she's a celebrated artist in New York, Molly Crabapple. She and I were writing letters to each other. This is the pandemic. And we were, we said to each other, we'll write letters. And Molly was sending me her art and I was writing her long stories. And that's what we were doing. And when this thing happened, something hit me and I called her. I said, Molly, we need to hop on Zoom. I have an idea. And we discussed this, that, would she draw? And she said she would. And I was delighted because Molly is one of these really extraordinary thinkers. She's a writer. She's written two gorgeous, memoirs. When she was a young person, she was fascinated by Dulac's paintings. And Dulac essentially was this eccentric person who translated, the 1001 Nights, for instance, and drew his own illustrations. And she was particularly fascinated by that. He had coins, he did a lot of stuff. But in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where Mughal paintings and Persian paintings were particularly exhibited, she would go and view them. And so when I told her this, and of course she'd read my book, she said to me, this would be my dream project. And so I just want to share one painting with you, and I have Molly's permission to share this. This is the scene for our young adult book, in which, so we don't have it in the archive, but based on that painting that you've already seen, Noor loading the musket, and studying the traditions. So I send her a huge amount of visual materials, then we discuss, and then she draws. So it is not that the book will be finished and illustrations will be done. I'm just giving you one side of the process. It took us about 4 months in our exchanges, and for her to, so I hope that I can share this with you. Here is Noor on the Howdah. This went into our proposal to Norton. And I think it is exquisite. Every detail, if you look at the turban or this Howdah, the seat, her dress, the long musket that she holds in the other book, every trinket on the elephant is backed by Mughal miniatures. So that's how succinctly she has studied this. What happens to the narrative? I want to just give you a little example of what happens to the narrative. Let's take this chapter here. This is the first chapter when she's born on the road. So what do I mean by tone in young adults? Lots of pauses, lots of sidebars, really gliding people's hands, and very interactive tone. So this is the first paragraph. In the autumn and winter of 1577, a large comet passed startlingly close to Earth. You could, this is a direct conversation with young persons, you could see and feel its effects. Astonished European astronomers called it the Great Comet. In India, the Mughal emperor was spellbound. He invited his astrologers to get their opinion on the comet's shape and effects. And so the Mughals have come early on, and so this becomes the reminder. The royal family that ruled India for more than 300 years, starting in the early. So very gentle hand. And these are, of course, notes to Molly about how I'm saying to her something simpler to suggest where they're coming from. These are Noor's parents, and we are talking to young people saying, meet the future superstars of Mughal India, right? And then you tell them about the title. And then how do you talk to them about history? My concern, I say, practice saying unfamiliar names. It is part of learning a new history. You can use their first names. So that's a lot.
Wow. That's very different, right? This is really amazing. Okay, we have a question from Felicia. She's wondering about the mechanics of breaking into public historical writing for publishers like Norton. Did you have an agent when pitching Empress, or can you speak to that process?
Yes, absolutely right. And I have a wonderful agent. I met her because of my editor in India, this dynamic person who was in the 2010s, she was starting this new trade movement in India, and she'd worked at Bloomsbury in London and now runs an independent press called Juggernaut. At that time, she headed Penguin, where Empress was published in India. So she linked my agent and I. I think it's an important step, because the first step, I think it's a great question. The first step is really, the first transition in my thinking came in writing a very different proposal, because my agent, Bridget, said to me, Ruby, what did she look like? Right? It's a question we don't ask because it's obvious to us, right? I mean, we are so arrogant about our works. So yes, I think learning with her was really very incredible. And yes, she pitched the book. So that's an essential step out there.
So it was really almost an editor, then an agent, then another editor.
In my case, yes, an Indian editor, had the idea, and then it was, of course, my mother had planted it, but I had somehow, waited for the calling from various other women.
That's wonderful. What would you say? I mean, just to close off, since we have a few minutes left. Oh no, we have another question. So I will ask that question instead in the few minutes that we have, from Camille, who asks, how do you work when, quote, translating for young adult? Do you work from what you have already written and translate it in a new style, or do you scratch from style? I can't speak.
Yeah.
Do you start from scratch? She's asking because she's bilingual and sometimes feels like she needs to translate a piece in her other language to take it further and then translate it back. So what does that feel like for you in this process?
Very lovely question. I was very shocked when Norton, made us an offer and said 30,000 words. This book is 87,000 words. And I thought to myself, no, I just can't do this. And of course, my agent said, of course you can do this. I think this is going to be an interesting challenge. And I think it's a lovely challenge because it's really the succinct character. So here's what I've done. I have a plan. There's an architecture of the older book, which is very, of course, fresh and livid in my head. And much of that story will stay together. I think where very complicated issues of, let's say, differences between legend and history, or complications of bringing in sources, those things, not always, I said with a light hand, they'll go in the sidebars, which will be visualized, right? And a lot of detail Molly is going to bring into pictorial sort of, insertions, if you will. So there is that. So I think really making it succinct is also practicing rewriting, but it's also a reimagination, right? The tone is a reimagination completely. I think I'm now beginning to settle in it. It's always a different book, but somehow it's helping me write my, I'm now in the final steps of the biography of Gulbadan as a first draft, but the succinct character is really helping me of the young adult book to go to that. Because in that, somehow I believe I've skirted the 2014 step, right? I think I've gone, and I believe that this middle young adult reminder has been really, it's like Noor has come to help, saying, you don't need 2014, now go on, do this.
You don't need to do the scholarly step. You can just go right
Don't
into
do the CUP step.
how, so I actually have a different question to close on if nobody else pops into the chat right now. I mean, it sounds like, I mean, I wonder how, to what extent your understanding of yourself and the work that you do has changed. I mean, this is kind of a huge question, and we could probably talk about it for 2 hours, but in about 3 minutes or so, has how you understand your work changed, or yourself as a creator and as a thinker, as a writer?
I love this. This is such a lovely question. And of course, when I come to Toronto, we'll talk more. Yeah, I think I see myself as a creative scholar now, not just as a scholar. And I'm, I love the idea that there are days that I can, this is my home study, that I can sometimes, not always, sit with one word and sit on it and think, or I'll take an image and I'll think, and I take my favorite writers and read. So there's a lot more pausing, there's a lot more breathing. Academic writing made me breathless, and I think it's really incredible what scholars do. It's backbreaking. It's really amazing. And I'll say one more time, I don't think that I can ever do what I do without, that foundation. But I think the practice is very different. And I think it is a practice now. And, obviously I feel very transformed. I feel very grateful. I feel this is a very political project in India. I just want to say that we have a Hindu right-wing regime that is wiping out all minorities, Muslims especially. And the Great Mughals of India, they've been truncated from large chapters to 5 pages in the book, right? So it's a political battle in India, and very much endorsed by secular historians, intellectuals who are artists who are at the forefront of fighting that battle. She's hugely popular in India. And there's a whole Empress Twitter group of Indian girls that I'm very grateful for. So I think there is a political charge so I'm very grateful for it.
Ruby, I have so much to say. Thank you so much. And thank you, I think, most of all, not just for your generosity in speaking with such depth and such precision about your process, but I think we got a sense of the pleasure you take in this, the meaning of the projects, and there's several different projects here, but also the joy of this kind of writing, which I think is often met with some level of anxiety or hesitation. And it's often difficult, right? It can be extremely challenging. But I know that it's so good to be reminded of what a joy it can be to expand the way we write, to expand the way we think about the past or about our area of study. To use the broader audience to know it more deeply. So thank you so much, Ruby. And I'm looking forward to another conversation with you in 2 days. I hope some of the people here today will join us for that. And have a lovely day, everyone. And I know we'll all take a lot away from this. Thank you.
Thank you. It's an honor, Irina. Thank you.
No, it's my honor.
Yeah. All right. Bye.